Okay, we should be live now. I'm just waiting for it to go live on Instagram here. And it looks like that one's live too. There we go. Okay, perfect. How are you doing?
I'm great. It's great to be here. This is a topic that I think is going to be really fun, exciting, and this is the next frontier, I think. So I'm really excited to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's everything embryo transfer, so there's definitely a lot of stuff we can go over. I really hope people come in and ask questions tonight. I know there's many people out there who have struggled with transfers and things like that. As I mentioned earlier on a couple posts and things that I have some exciting news tonight talking about embryo transfers, going to be announcing probably about midway through. Well, I mean, do you want to start things off and kind of, talk a little bit about transfers? I for myself, I mean, it's kind of a weird topic for us because we can talk about transfers, but really, people having questions. But how did you want to start this off?
Maybe just like for a quick second, I think it's kind of fun to look back at where we came from with embryo transfers. And, historically, not that long ago, the norm was like a fresh day 3 embryo transfer. So what does that mean? It would mean that you had gone just through an IVF cycle, and then you would immediately, create embryos in the lab. They would grow till the 3rd day, and then you would immediately transfer them back into the uterus. And this was at a time when we didn't have, PGT, or PGT that we had was very bad. It was a time where we didn't feel as confident freezing embryos. It was a time where we didn't feel as confident growing embryos to day 5, because that day 3 to day 5, it really, now we found out that it really shakes out sort of the not so good embryos and lets the good ones continue growing. And so that's kind of where we've come from. And over time, we've now come to this, radically different type of way of doing embryo transfers, which is frozen embryo transfers, day 5 embryo transfers, elective single embryo transfers, PGT-tested embryos. And these are all things that have vastly improved the rates of success that we have when we transfer embryos. And so I hope we get a chance to talk about some of those things. But, that's where we've come from. I'm also very excited about where we're going with embryo transfers, because I do think that this is where we haven't yet made enormous progress. I think with embryo culture in the lab, we've made enormous progress. With ovarian stimulation, we've made a ton of progress. With genetics, we made enormous progress. We don't really totally understand what's happening when the embryo is implanting into the endometrium. I mean, of course, we understand some of the basic science, but we don't totally understand it. And that's why, in small part, there seems to be a little bit of a ceiling with regards to, transferring a very high quality embryo. You still don't get 100% success rates. And I think that difference there has a lot to do with, optimizing the endometrial lining. So we'll talk about some of those things, but maybe I'll just stop there for a moment and see kind of what your take is on the intro for this topic here.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the thing you brought up about frozen transfers is really interesting, because you're right. I mean, I remember back in the day when, you did IVF, you did a fresh transfer. You didn't do a frozen transfer. I mean, everything was fresh. I mean, remember that we used to say fresh is best. That was what we tell people, and we'd avoid everything possible to, to freeze embryos. Really, the only time you were freezing embryos in the past was one of 2 times. The first would be if someone was getting OHSS and you wanted to stop them from having OHSS. The second time would be is you had some extra embryos left over, and not many people have extra embryos left over because we were doing more slow freezing. We weren't doing vitrification. And what's interesting is I'm sure I've heard stories. I don't know if it's true, but the stories I heard is what actually led to frozen transfers was the whole time when Richard Scott was going around telling the country how, his PGT was at that time called actually, was it PGS at that time, or no, it was PGS at that time. He was going around telling everyone that his PGS was better because he could do it in the office and he could do a fresh transfer on day 6. And that, everyone else had to freeze them, it would be bad. And so I think it was CSRM actually was working with him. And so they were doing a study, and they had to freeze all theirs, of course, and because they were being sent out, and they had higher pregnancy rates using the same thing, and was kind of like, wait a second here, is there a benefit? But what's interesting about that is, I think this is really important for people, is what is it that really makes it better? I mean, is there something like, is it always better, or is fresh bad? And I think that's something that's got lost sometimes, that fresh isn't good. And that's not true. I mean, matter of fact, a fresh transfer can be just as good as a frozen transfer. The issue really comes down to, I think, a couple of things that I would say, and I'd love to hear your point of view. One of the things is that when you do IVF, it's not cheap, and most people don't want to do it more than one time. So you want to make a lot of eggs. And when you make a lot of eggs, the problem is that your estrogen levels go high, and that starts to affect them progesterone levels, and that could affect timing issues and affect the implantation. So it affects the window of implantation by doing that. And so it starts the clock too soon. So that's the major reason. But if we wouldn't just made 6 eggs, 8 eggs on everyone, we really wouldn't have to worry about it. I mean, you could still do fresh transfers to be just as good. But like I said, that most people don't want that. They're like, no, I'd rather have more. And so the other benefit, I think, of having a frozen transfer is it allows for better preparation. When you used to do fresh transfers, there really wasn't like let's take a pause. It was kind of like, oh, well, this is what we got. Let's put it back. And, now I could sit there and just go, I don't like the look of it so much. I say, let's not go this month, and we can adjust and make sure we have the best lining possible. And so I think frozen transfers have definitely helped a ton. But I do think it's important for people to know that fresh transfers aren't bad. It's just in certain situations. The biggest group that's benefited the most from frozen transfers is women with polycystic ovarian syndrome. They by far have had the most benefit, because their progesterone levels would go up more than most. And so anyways, I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing you brought up about the frozen transfers. And I think it's one of the things that it's become so commonplace now that I've had people get worried when we do a fresh transfer. They're like, is it bad? I'm like, no, it's not bad at all.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's such an interesting point. And I think I want to highlight what you said too, about the fact that, when you do a frozen embryo transfer, you can really set, that patient up for success, meaning that you can focus all of the effort on making sure the lining gets thick enough, making sure, the progesterone is still low, making sure that from a lifestyle standpoint, everything has been optimized. And that's really hard to do when you're trying to kind of do the joint effort of growing eggs in the ovaries and making sure the lining is at the appropriate place. And you kind of have to, a lot of times, almost sacrifice one a little bit so that you get the other one optimized. And I think that's a really interesting part of, frozen embryo transfers and where we're going with everything. And I think, more and more clinics are doing exclusively for frozen embryo transfers.
Yeah. I think for people who are coming on watching the show today, who maybe don't understand what we're talking about, I think it's important for everyone to understand, so everyone knows what we're talking about. IVF, there's a process. You retrieve eggs from someone's body, you make embryos, and then at some point you put those embryos back into the person's body, which is called an embryo transfer, which is what we're talking about tonight. So in case anyone wasn't sure about that, sometimes it can be all done at the same time, whereas when you retrieve the eggs, 5 days later, you put the embryo back, or they could be frozen and then they can be transferred. And like we were talking about, we're in a unique time with vitrification where it allows, the ability to do frozen transfers at a very high rate. I think a couple of things I think would be great to talk about tonight. So if you're listening, again, please feel free to talk to them. But I think, one is talking about what we were talking about, frozen, fresh, questions about that. The embryo preparation, what are the different ways to do it? Is there only one way? Talking a little bit about things like, grading. Why do we pick embryos that we pick? Talking about our techniques, is there different techniques? Is there differences between doctors? There's definitely studies out there that show that. And then, kind of the other things is, what things benefit the transfer, such as like there's acupuncture and things like that. We've had Amy on recently about talking about acupuncture, how that helps. And so anything else you think that might be some good topics for people to come in with questions about?
Yeah, I mean, since we're talking about this also, we're talking a lot more just everywhere about single embryo transfer versus historically where we would do more than a single embryo. We do double embryo transfers and even in certain contexts, even more. But now, that takes into consideration all the stuff around PGT. And I think definitely, there's been some myths out there that would be interesting to go over, and would love for some people to come on. And, I have a couple myths in the back of my mind that I've heard over time, but, definitely some myths out there about, what to do and what not to do at embryo transfer. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, we have a couple questions coming in. We can start there. We can also start with a topic, wherever you want to take it, Dr. Amos.
Yeah, let's start with this question right here. I think it's a great question. And it says, hey doctors, Fargo here. Question for you: is there any benefit to a fresh transfer if not doing PGS testing? And so her specific example is, is there less chance of damage when you don't freeze it in the thawing? And again, if you want to answer this one, I can definitely give the generic answer, which is the difference between statistical differences and differences, right? And so, statistically speaking, no, there's really not that big of a difference, because the risk of the embryo is so low with freezing it and thawing it that the statistical chance is not better. But obviously, it's like someone saying, your statistical chances of getting shot in Chicago is low, but if you're the guy getting shot, it's 100% at that moment. And so there is an absolute technical risk of, yes, anytime you freeze it, you do add that risk, but it's so small that it really shouldn't make someone want to do a fresh transfer. Right. I don't know what you would have to add to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I that's the way I kind of phrase it. I mean, I think that, every time that you do anything to an embryo, I mean, it's like, is there extra risk in driving an extra mile on the freeway? Just to use another example. And yeah, there is a little bit of risk there. I mean, how does the risk compare to 20 years ago when we first started doing frozen embryos at this stage? Well, the risk is way lower. The risk is somewhere in the 1% or under 1% range that the embryo isn't going to survive the thaw. But what about the benefits of doing an embryo transfer, a frozen embryo transfer? And it does seem like the benefits outweigh the disadvantages of that 1%. So from that standpoint, I think it's really hard. And then again, going back to your point, like if you're that one person where, gosh, the embryo didn't survive the thaw, then it's horrible. But yeah, again, then would you treat the other 99 people with fresh embryo transfers? And the short answer is no, not just for that 1%.
Yeah. And I think you just said a second ago, like that risk factor, there's risk in all of it, right? I always tell people when they get worried about even biopsying embryo, does it hurt the embryo? I'm like, yeah, there's a risk. But I mean, injecting a sperm into an egg, I mean, that's one cell, right? You ruin that, the cell's over. So there's a lot of risk in it, but like you said, there's so much benefit. I'm never against doing a fresh transfer, meaning like if it's something your clinic does, it's not a bad thing, but it's important though if you're making a lot of eggs. So it's not just about the PGS testing. Again, that's one reason for freezing embryos. But the bigger benefit, like I said, where that study came from, where the whole point is two different clinics were sitting in there doing PGT. One was doing the fresh transfer, one was doing the frozen, and the one with frozen had higher pregnancy rates. And that's because what we learned is that the freezing of the embryos allowed the lining to shed, and we're able to start and develop a lining perfectly for the transfer. And so there is benefit from a frozen transfer, but there are scenarios where they're equal. So, but there's at least no harm that we know of as right now, except for people's behinds because of the progesterone injections that they give themselves. That can be a little bit harmful, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I guess that's not fair. We're not the ones taking the progesterone. So, okay, that's not too fair for us to say, huh?
Yeah. I don't know if you want to tackle this question here.
All right. Yes. Hi, docs. You may have already had this one on the agenda with frozen embryo transfer. When does the thawing process begin on your side in prep for transfer? And is there anything you can see at the time before the actual process that would lead in another direction? So yeah, thank you so much for that question, April. This is a great question. So embryo transfers, the thawing of the embryo happens that same day. Generally a couple hours is what it takes for an embryo to thaw and be ready for an embryo transfer. There are some small variations of that depending on if the embryo needs to have like embryo glue or something of that kind. Different protocols a little bit in different clinics, but ballpark, that's kind of when it happens. So then do you have something that you could do based on that would change with direction? Well, definitely. I mean, so the first thing that we always look for is that the embryo survived the thaw. That's really important. When you are, thawing this embryo, it's going to have some amount of, the cells expanding, and then, the substances that are in and around the embryo that are basically like cryoprotectants. They're kind of like antifreeze for embryos. They're going to exit the embryo, and you have to kind of make sure that the embryo is expanded appropriate and it looks good and it looks healthy. And there's certain characteristics that the embryologists are looking for. And if it doesn't have those, then we have to say, hey, the embryo didn't survive the thaw. And in that case, it takes us to say, well, we need to talk with our patient, say, hey, very unfortunately, it didn't survive the thaw. We need to maybe thaw the next embryo or whatever the next thing would be in that process. And that's a really important step at that stage, because you don't want to transfer an embryo, of course, that didn't survive. In terms of other things that you would be looking for, I mean, I'm trying to think what other kinds of directions one could go in. Dr. Amos, what comes to mind with this? I'm trying to think. It's a great question.
Yeah. I mean, this actually happened to us today. So I had a patient who was going for a transfer today. When they went to go thaw the embryo was alive. Everything was fine, but there's a little bit of a granulation on the embryo. There was a little bit of a concern that what if this embryo doesn't continue to survive, and go. And granulation doesn't mean the embryo is going to pass away. It could eventually get rid of those cells and everything will go fine. But those cells that had the granulation could be the beginning of the end. Interesting enough, podcast is what I did last night about cellular death. And so in that situation, we felt it was worth telling the patient that the embryos survive and could definitely lead to a pregnancy, but it might be worth actually thawing a second embryo in this situation. And that way we'll have it available. It was a little bit unique because she was in embryo glue and has to sit there for several hours. So we had to make the decision earlier than versus just waiting later and checking again. But there are times that, when you thaw an embryo, you can see things that might be concerning. It's not very common. But in that situation, the different direction could be is that you would thaw another embryo in that situation. The other thing is also at the transfer. I mean, it doesn't happen very often, but I've had it twice now in my career where I've went to go do a transfer and we're like, there's fluid in the uterus. And then we see fluid and then we have to cancel the transfer and refreeze the embryo. And by the way, both of those people ended up having success with their transfer, being able to get pregnant after we rethawed them. Those are kind of the things I'm thinking of. I agree with you. It's a great question. I'm just trying to think of any other thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it gets to another question though. And this is great, April, that you asked this. I mean, the idea is there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that the embryologists and the doctors are cross-talking about. They're talking about all these things before your embryo transfer happens and just confirming, like, a pilot does on his checklist, that everything is, all systems go to have the best possible outcome. And if we're not there, then we kind of navigate in those hours beforehand. So fortunately, that doesn't happen often. Most things go exactly according to plan. But when there's a little bit of a change, it's not a bad thing. It's that we're trying to further optimize for the situation.
I just want to remind people again that, all the things we're going over are questions you guys have and what we think is good questions. But if you have questions, remember, don't feel dumb getting on asking them. Someone else is probably thinking them, and you don't have to show your face. So if you're worried about that, please come on. And like I said, it really is beneficial for everyone. One thing I saw someone ask from in the Instagram was, would double embryo transfer increase my chances of getting pregnant? And obviously, this is a very good question. This is, as you mentioned earlier, in the past, we used to transfer multiple embryos. One of the most famous cases is Octomom. Not many people realize how that was. I mean, when you talk about hitting all the specific parameters they had to happen, that was where they transferred 6 embryos. and all of them took, and 2 of them split, which is what got your Octomom, from what I understand. No one does that, and that was even very rare. But the question is, does it benefit you? And there's definitely a lot of things out there. I've had doctors will sit there and tell you that, no, it's not better, which is ludicrous. There always is an improvement by putting back 2. But the case where I like to talk about, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, Dr. Salem, is that every time you have more than 1 embryo in there, though, you have double the risk. So you have 2 embryos, you have twice the risk. 3 embryos, 3 times the risk of something going wrong. And so my philosophy, what I tell people was, I think there is nothing wrong with twins, but there's no question if you only have 2 embryos and you put them both back at the same time, your technical chances of getting pregnant are higher than if you just put 1 back.
Right.
But your chances of having a live birth are actually higher if you put 1 back at a time, because if something happens with those 2, you lose them both potentially. Whereas if you put 1 back and something happens, you have a subchorionic hemorrhage, you just lose that one and not the other. And so there truly is a benefit of 1 at a time. Now, that being said, again, my preference is, I still think, I still think people should be allowed to put back 2, but as you and I both know, which that is not an announcement tonight, but one of the changes we have to make at our clinic is we're going to have to go to not allowing elective 2, because insurances now are coming after clinics and not even removing their contracts. So multiple embryos is definitely going to be a thing of the past, and it's going to be very, very rare in the future because of people, pushing it on. But what is your thoughts on that too? I mean, clearly there's a benefit. There's no question there's a benefit, and there are times and places for it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, anybody that argues that putting in 2 embryos is going to lead to a lower success rate than 1 embryo in that individual embryo transfer, as long as the embryos are like equally graded and everything, isn't telling you the full story. The question is, how much better is it? And is it worth the risk? And the simple answer is, it's probably not worth the risk for most people. And I'm qualifying it, most people. So there are some people out there where definitely there's going to be benefit. And those are, that's why medicine has to be personalized. We have to take it on a case-by-case basis. But, there was a good study that was once done where they did double embryo transfers and single embryo transfers and of PGT-tested embryos. And what was really impressive was, first of all, the success rates were really good. So I think in the single embryo transfer rate, I want to say it was roughly like a 60% pregnancy rate. And in the double embryo transfer, it was like something in the low 80s. I mean, it was just super high pregnancy rate.
Yeah.
The problem was it was also a 40% twinning rate. And most people would say twins, great, one and done. That's awesome. All of the folks out there who have twins, who are healthy, who are, beautiful children, are like, twins are wonderful. And I agree with that 100%. Unfortunately, not all twins do as well. And, there's obstetric complications. There's certain things that don't go well in pregnancy, preterm delivery. So, some of these things make us think twice about the benefits versus the disadvantages. But anyway, that's my long-winded way of saying I agree.
Yeah. It's like I said, it's going to become a thing of the past, and I think just so people understand where also that comes from a insurance standpoint, a twin pregnancy cost-wise, and I think that was something else they looked in the study, was like, well, it's just the cost was tremendously more than a single pregnancy because of all the complications, preterm labor, all different things, and so it's just, like I said, unfortunately, insurances are changing the industry a little bit. But you're right. I mean, what if someone has like 2 days 7 embryos, or has untested embryos that are poor quality? It makes sense to do in those situations. That's what you said, individualize. And that's exactly how we're going to go to our clinic now, is just individualize it. But I see we got someone here way in the back. And so, again, that's what we say. These are the best questions. So we'll bring on Aaron here.
Hey, Aaron.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me on.
How are you doing?
Coming on.
I'm doing good. Good to see you. I'm actually on a work trip in Cincinnati, and I have a couple questions. So, our situation, Dr. Salem, Dr. Emil is obviously familiar with our situation, but I have in particular, I have low sperm count and low motility. And then when we just did a egg retrieval and fertilization with my wife Shayla, and had I guess pretty low fertilization. Well, the way you described it, Dr. Emmels, was that a lot of the eggs fertilized but didn't grow, they didn't progress. And then the one that did had a genetic abnormality. And so I've just been curious, honestly, because we come from different ethnic backgrounds. I'm curious if that plays a factor in the sperm and the egg talking, and then well, I guess that's my first question. I have other questions if you want me to go there.
And Dr. Salem specifically, he's talking about is like abnormal fertilization, so like
Okay.
we've got like 0 PNs and stuff like that. So
Got it. Thank you. Yeah. Do you want to tackle this one first, Dr. Emmels? I mean, I have like my 2 cents on your specific question, Aaron, which is a great question. I'm so glad you asked that.
Thank you.
yeah, I mean, Aaron, I'm sure I've mentioned to you before. I mean, I have very bad sperm too, and so my wife and I, the only way we get pregnant is with IVF. We had to do ICSI as well, just because I have severe sperm. It's weird, like I was talking to someone this morning about this, that I actually had a gentleman ask me, hey, if you put the sperm in and it doesn't fertilize normal, can't you just do it again? And I'm like, well, no, it's over. It's like a one-shot thing. When you put the sperm in, the sperm's in the egg, and the sperm and egg come together and they fertilize. And when we talk about fertilization, what that means is it means the egg underwent its last split. And so the part you have to understand is that eggs are stuck in what we call prophase 1 of meiosis. And when they're mature, they undergo a division, but it's an unequal division. And so a little tiny polar body comes out, and the rest of the egg gets all the cytoplasm. That's how the egg gets so big, biggest cell in the human body. And then when it undergoes fertilization, the way we're able to tell it fertilized is by it undergoes the last division, and that releases the other polar body. And so then we know it fertilized. But there's another thing that has to happen, and the DNA of the female and the male have to somehow combine together in a way, right? That's what makes now this new human. And for some reason, at times, it doesn't go as well. And so we get these things like 0 PNs, 1 PNs, 3 PNs. And the PNs stand for pronuclei. They're these little structures that show up for a very short amount of time. And it lets us know that something went wrong. Now, sometimes it could just be a displaced window where we don't see them in 0 PNs. But the point is that it tells us it didn't fertilize normal. Now, your question about, hey, is it possible, like we come from different cultures or different things, is that going to affect it? We don't think so. I mean, people have babies all over the world, right, from different cultures, no problems at all. So there doesn't appear to be anything that would support that. It's a great question. Now, there could be something else, right? There could be, there's always this fear everyone has, like, hey, are we incompatible? Like, is there something wrong with our sperm and egg? But there could be things like at the level of the sperm or at the level of the egg, and that maybe there's small problems where they're just not getting together as well, right? That DNA is not going. So there can be things going on, but it's not a cultural or a specific thing. Like, you guys didn't meet the wrong partner. I used to joke around with my wife, say, man, you met the wrong partner. Unfortunately, ours doesn't work so well. I'd love to hear what you had to say as Dr. Sean, but hopefully they answered the question of what you were asking about. Is it possible that that sperm and egg don't work together, incompatible? And the answer is no. And there are doctors out there, by the way, who tell people this. Oh, it's incompatible. That's the problem. And that's insane. I mean, that's just completely insane. So.
Yeah. No, like here's the thing, right? And I mean, the point that some people are trying to make, and they're taking it a lot of times from a reproductive immunology standpoint, is they're saying there's kind of like the immune system of the mother is rejecting the sperm or attacking the sperm, or something is happening at that level that's making it such that it's just not allowing for fertilization to take place at all. And no study has shown that in any way, like to be a real thing. So they're trying to, unfortunately, in my opinion, peddle kind of therapies that are not yet actually proven to work to kind of mitigate the risks of this. So, when we talk also about, genetic diversity, I mean, actually it's the opposite, right? Like if you're increasing the amount of genetic diversity or decreasing the risks of genetic recessive conditions, which certain groups have a higher carrier status than other groups. And so when you can kind of combine sperm and egg, you're less likely to have children with those specific diseases. So in some ways, it's actually hypothesized that it could be even like protective against, certain conditions. But yeah, I agree. I think this is not a, sperm and egg don't work together. It can be an egg quality issue. It can be a DNA fragmentation issue potentially in the sperm. Whenever you have sperm issues, low counts, low motility, there's generally, those are just generally like proxies for something else that's also happening with the sperm that you have to tackle. And sometimes it's just a low efficiency environment, and that's okay, but you eventually get there. And I think that's the key.
Gotcha. Well, thanks so much. Is it okay if I ask one more question?
Of course.
Yeah.
So we had suspicions that I had a varicocele, and then also, well, we know from different blood work over time that, I just have low testosterone levels. Went to a urologist, and then did ultrasounds. Both ultrasounds showed that I didn't have a varicocele. And so my question is, as we try to ramp up for another retrieval and fertilization, are there specific things that I can do to try to increase not only my numbers, but just the overall health of my sperm?
Yeah, absolutely. Doesn't matter if you want to start first, then I'll give my two pieces. We've talked about this before in the past.
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many ways to improve. There are so many ways to improve sperm, but each one of them is incremental. Like each one of them has a small role to play. So I'll just give you an example, kind of a few, and I'll give you even an example of, I think, a couple of things that have been tried and unfortunately maybe haven't worked. So one of the, newer elements that's coming out, and, some folks at the American Urological Association are putting this forward from a male reproductive standpoint, is this idea of more frequent ejaculation right before giving the specimen for IVF, for ICSI. And, some of them are proposing even as much as, every day in the 2-3 days beforehand. And that basically, you do get less sperm, and everybody's worried about that. But the idea is, this fresh sperm is a higher quality sperm, and maybe that leads to better fertilization. And so there's definitely some opinion pieces out there by some of the doctors that would say that, the male reproductive doctors. The other things are just kind of our basic things. A lot of hormones, testosterone especially, is made primarily at night, overnight. And so you want to have really good sleep hygiene, minimizing alcohol, which can really play a role in, harming the quality of the hormone production and namely like sperm production. Eating a lot of foods that are high in antioxidants, so green leafy veggies, things like that, minimizing sugars, weight-bearing exercise. Now, all these things kind of come together little by little, and they don't happen overnight either. That's the hard part. Like some of these things take some time. And the worst part of it is, this isn't the kind of thing that's going to take sperm from being, a 3 out of 10 to like a 9 out of 10. This is just going to incrementally increase it to get us to the point where it's a little bit more efficient going forward with IVF. But interestingly, there's been some things that haven't worked either. And I think it's important to know some of these, like certain supplements for men. There was a trial run by the, Reproductive Medicine Network, and they tried this combo of all these supplements, and it totally didn't work. And they even stopped the trial early. Now, does it mean that I say like don't take any supplements? No, but I'm just more cautious about recommending supplements. So, that's the kind of, way we think about these things as we're going through. But yeah, what about you, Dr. Amos? What do you tell folks about this? How do you improve sperm quality? And
Yeah, it's all the things you said were perfect. I think there's a couple things, as you were mentioning about that study, saying like they're even talking about now, like where someone does a double ejaculation, where they like, you ejaculate and then you do it again, and then we take that sperm. Like and what's interesting about that is you don't make the sperm. The sperm's already been made. It's just kind of coming down the tubes. But there's just something about the sperm sitting in epididymis that causes problems, and we know this even from testis samples. We know that when you do like a test sample or microtesty, where you extract the sperm right from the testicle, we get better quality sperm when it comes to things like fragmentation and stuff like that. The biggest thing with the heat sources, Aaron, is when it comes to these varicocele, it's weird. Different sizes can affect it, right? There's some people have significant. I had a very significant varicocele, and I mean significant, like as bad as it gets. So mine, would have made a difference. Unfortunately, I didn't get treated right away, got treated later in life. So even after fixing it, didn't help my sperm because it was just, I've already killed that area already with the heat. Biggest thing I think with sperm is heat, just trying to stay away from heat. You can also help sperm in other ways too, though. So for example, like let's say there's concern for DNA fragmentation. You can use things like the Zymot chip or fluid, ways to dynamics to get rid of the bad sperm and get lower fragmentation. You can do things like you've heard people like talk about knuckle in hot tub and stuff. Again, staying from the heat, keeping your legs spread open. So I tell man spread as much as you can, keeping the cool there. Even women with growth hormone, there's some question I've seen where I've actually seen benefit of giving women growth hormone, and it actually helps the male sperm. And we know this. There's actually data that supports that if you take a young woman who is very fertile and you have her with an older man, they'll do better than if you take a woman who's older with an older man. Now, of course, anyone who is older is going to have lower chances, but even when you look at it and analyze it for that, even comparing the two, what you find is that there's actually improvements just being the younger women. And that's because of that ability of the woman's eggs to be able to fix some of the sperm problems. And so that's where growth hormone can come in. When we talk about your situation, and again, I don't want to get too specific because obviously it's yours, but one of the positive things, I think the thing where you can see a lot of hope is that even though a lot of them fertilize abnormal, the ones that fertilize normal did exactly what we expect after that, right? I get much more concerned when someone has a bunch of normal fertilization and then nothing makes it to the end. I'm like, oh, that's weird. They didn't even follow the normal progression. Yours did. Problem is that fertilization, and there's also just chance. We have to remember that. I mean, the average person, right? We don't even call them infertile for a year. That means 12 times, 11 times in a year, they could not get pregnant. Something could go wrong in their body, and no one blinks an eye. And so when you take it from that standpoint, you go, well, listen, I got around close to 12 eggs, which you guys did. Realistic in life, we wouldn't even expect to go perfect every time. And so there is sometimes it's just fluky, and doing another cycle could be the answer. But what we do as clinicians and us is we then say, where could there be other problems? Let's fix those. If we're wrong, it's just a fluke. Great. It's going to be better the next time, but at least we went after the other issues. And those are things that we talked about, all three of us, when we spoke, and those are the things that we're going to make the adjustments on. So.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on. Like I said, thanks for being brave. Everyone else is scared. So you have a good one, Aaron. Bye. Really good questions, man. And I think that's something that, is a really hard thing to understand. I always tell people, everyone's always worried how many eggs they get. Everyone's worried how many embryos they get. My biggest fear is fertilization day. That's my biggest fear for everyone, because almost every aspect we can follow, right? You can fertilize me, okay, we're going to get at least around 70, 80%, meaning like that will actually fertilize. Once you make embryos, that like half of them are probably going to make it to blastocyst. But the one thing you don't know is that will be normal fertilization. And there are just these weird cases, and they're not that common, but where you just get a lot of these 0 PNs, or you get a lot of people with 3 PNs. And it's important for people to understand that a lot of times you see a lot of 3 PNs, 4 PNs, stuff like that. You start wondering if it's more of an egg issue. There is a general sense that there could be an egg issue. And that's, again, reason men get a pass is because they're making sperm all the time. So their sperm, doesn't have that same concern of having, extra chromosome in them. But I mean, I don't feel like I see it often. It's just so tragic when it happens. What do you do in those situations? What do you talk to people about when you see that?
Yeah, I mean, it is tragic, right? I mean, I think, one of the concerns, just going back, not to necessarily couples with severe male factor, but like just fertilization in general. One of the reasons, I would say one has kind of a little bit of a lower threshold to say, hey, let's do ICSI, meaning I tend to do ICSI for, quite honestly, a lot of folks, is that there is this 2% total fertilization failure that's out there if you don't do ICSI that you would have never known about. And the cycle is done. None of the eggs fertilize and the cycle is done. Everything's gone. You can't salvage that anymore. And so I think this fertilization step is really one in which, while the vast majority of the time things go average and they go great, every once in a while you get these fluky things that can happen. And it has to do with the cellular machinery, elements that we probably don't fully appreciate, understand yet. And sometimes you just have to go into another cycle. The next cycle goes completely differently. And you just say, you know what? I can't totally explain it, but that's not what we're here for today. We're here to help you have a baby.
No. So I got to jump on this next question because I think it's probably the most important question that we'll probably talk about tonight. And I'm just going to knock this one up here, which is the myth about FT of having McDonald French fries. So what I can tell you is there is absolutely tons of scientific literature showing that McDonald French fries are the answer to things. And if you don't believe it, the question is, they're so good, why would you care anyway? So I definitely feel the McDonald thing is true. The science is just because I like them and I feel like everyone needs them, gets pregnant. But to your point, yes, they're definitely delicious, but there is probably not real science behind it. So
what I've heard is you've got to have the doctor eat the French fries as well, and then you get that
by us the French fries.
Right, that's right. No.
Always thinking ahead. I like it. I love Dr.
definitely don't buy us the French fries. But we can't recommend against going to get some French fries.
Yeah. So a couple other questions, some questions here. This is one where I'm gonna let you kind of jump on that. Was kind of just asked a little bit ago, like what can you do to improve sperm? What can you do? And this kind of that same thing. I'd love for you to answer. So one of the things I've even done in podcasts I talk about is that there's a difference between a bad lining that's just chance and a bad line because there's something wrong.
Yeah.
One of the things I get asked a lot of times is, is there something wrong? And their line's developing perfect. And I said, listen, if there was some other scarring, some other major issue that was affecting the lining, you would see it. It wouldn't grow. Like the cases are bad. I can see it. I see it go, listen, it looks weird. And so a lot of times people are worried about this, but a lot of times things go fine. I just love to see what your thought is on this about building the lining and stuff. Because again, not building lining isn't that common. And there's pathological times that it makes sense why they get thicker.
Yeah. I think those are like the two groups, right? You've got the one group of patients where the lining just won't build. Like you can't get it beyond, 5 or 6 millimeters. It never looks quite trilaminar. And there's all these actual reasons that we can, get into about that. And then there's another group of people where it's like you said, like the lining is, usually growing well. Like we did their IVF cycle. We know their lining can get thick enough, et cetera. But it just happens to be in this one cycle, they're developing a little bit of fluid or something's not going quite right, or it's not getting thick, or it's not trilaminar, all these kind of hallmark signs that we look for it to be really great. Now, going back to this about, is there any data behind vitamins, supplements, foods? I wish there were, because it would make our lives so much easier, especially around the embryo transfer. The first thing is, this is really hard to study. Like how do you have all these different vitamins and supplements and make sure that only one group is exposed to the one different thing that you're looking at. The other part of it is, is there some science behind certain things? that just sort of makes sense that we would want to do these things. For an easy one is vitamin D, right? So vitamin D, it's been associated, if it's really low, with miscarriages. So of course we would want to optimize your vitamin D levels before going through. Or folic acid. Of course we would want to make sure you have folic acid in prenatal vitamin prior to going through an embryo transfer. But about the uterine lining itself, I can't say there's anything that I know improves it from a supplement standpoint.
Yeah, and I think one thing to add too is there are vitamins and supplements in foods, right? So to really do a study of this, okay, you can't eat these greens, you can't eat this. I mean, it would be a very difficult thing. And I think the most important part is, as I always tell people, ask your doctor questions if you're concerned about it. But in the end, I mean, most people don't need anything. And that's the thing we sometimes forget. You know, when we're doing all this stuff, we forget that people naturally are getting pregnant. And when people have infertility, there are real causes, right? If you have a sperm problem, my wife and I, that was the cause. So we were never worried about the lining. And doesn't mean the lining was perfect, but it was good enough. And so all those things I think people worry about. I think the most important thing is if your line is developing well and it looks good, probably nothing to worry about, you know. But the things you can be doing that will always help is reduce inflammation, low carb diets, things like that, taking your prenatal vitamins. The one thing I forgot, because I didn't realize we're already past halfway the show, is I said there was a big announcement. So I do want to make that announcement because I've been, and this is actually really, really cool. And it falls on the transfer. So we recently did a study. And this study, we're working with another company. And we were trying to determine if this device works as good as freezing, is like an automatic freezing device, as doing it manually. So what's interesting is we made embryos. And when we made these embryos were made with donor eggs and donor sperm. Now we have embryos. And these embryos are now donor embryos. It's a little bit different. Normally, when you have donor embryos, you have a family that made embryos. They're done having kids. And then they give those embryos away to someone else, which is great. It's amazing. We actually are not an embryo donation clinic, so we can't do that. But what's unique about these embryos are there is no other family with them. These embryos were created from a donor sperm and donor egg that don't know each other. And so these are just basically embryos to be adopted. And the reason why I want to announce it is that we're not, you know, charging for them. If you actually have a transfer available, you can do it with a transfer. There's lots of different things, but it's a little bit different than the normal way. Normally, you know, you have another family behind them and stuff like that. There's siblings out there. This would be different. So we have these embryos from this study left over. And there are certain embryos that do have to have very specific criteria to go in certain people. But some don't. Some have no criteria at all, and we can put them in anybody. And so if you are interested in this and you would want to use the donors, and we have some donors are Chinese embryos, there's Caucasian embryos, we have lots of different ones, but in the end, it's basically adopting a baby. But you're adopting a baby to go into your body. And we just have this really unique opportunity right now because of this study. We have all these embryos, and we haven't announced, we first told some of our patients about it, but now we're opening up to everyone. And if it's something you're interested in, reach out to New Direction Fertility Centers. Talk to the third-party coordinator, let her know, and we can get you on that list. But it's just a really, really neat thing. You'll learn everything about the donors. So we have all the information, like I said, about them. But just a really cool thing that's not very common. I'll be honest, first time I've ever even heard of anything like this happen. To make embryos in a study takes like an IRB protocol. It's it's a very it's a little bit of an ethical dilemma because you're making these babies. And so to me, I think it's just so amazing that we can get give people these embryos. And like I said, because we're not embryo donation, we can't take embryos from other people, but these we can because there are no other person associated with them. So if it's something you're interested in, like I said, please reach out. Don't reach out here because I probably won't see the comments, but reach out to the clinic through the website, whatever way, and just let them know you're interested in the donor embryos, and they'll give you more information. So anyway, sorry the takeoff from there. When talking about transfers, I know a couple things people always ask about is like, what things do we have now to improve it? And so you were talking about earlier, like, where we've come and gone. Like, so in the past, when it didn't work, you just tried again, right? It was just a trial and error. Okay, let's do this. And so I remember back in the day, like when a transfer didn't work, you say, okay, let's give an extra day of progesterone, or let's do a natural cycle this time, and we just kind of guessed. And now we do have some tools like the ERA, the Receptiva test. What are your thoughts on obviously that people sometimes do this a little ahead of time, but what are you most excited about coming up? Like what's next? What do you think is the next thing that's going to come out?
Yeah, I think we're just on the cusp of learning a lot around, that genetic fingerprint of the endometrium. And we've, there are some companies that have developed some really cool tools around this. It just, usually just like anything, the first couple iterations of the technology are not the ones that take. And it's usually, the second, third, fourth iteration of that technology. So what I'm really interested in is further personalizing that embryo transfer process, lining up that individual's kind of window of opportunity with how much estrogen they need, how much progesterone they need, how many days of progesterone they need, with really a kind of optimizing everything on that standpoint. And I think we're going to make a lot of progress there in the near future. The second little part that I'm interested in is for a different group of people, which is the group of people that have these implantation failures, the group that has very thin linings, the group that, so one thing, and again, this has not been borne out in the science, so I don't want to put it out there as fact at this point, but it appears to be that some people who have had, for example, an IUD for a very long period of time and never kind of took it out and, gave the endometrium a chance to grow back. Some of them, a very small minority, appear to have endometriums that aren't growing back quite as thick anymore. And, various physician scientists are looking at different ways to optimize that, whether that's through like intrauterine PRP or some other factors, growth factors in the uterus that can regenerate some of those cells. Maybe the future is cell therapy, stem cell therapy, where we can actually put stem cells back into the uterus. And this seems like a great use of stem cell therapy, where you're putting, those progenitor cells of the endometrium to grow a better lining after one sort of can't grow anymore. And this would be a huge step forward, I think, to, help people who are having these recurrent implantation failures, just can't get pregnant. And it is, to be fair, a small proportion of people, but for those people, it is so impactful that I think, further research is so worth it. But what about you? What do you think is on the horizon here?
Exactly where you were coming from, which is, I think, customizing, but also having a little bit more information before the transfer. Again, I toot my own little horn about talk about Fertility Tuesday. One of the things I talked about yesterday was this idea of when an embryo doesn't work, why it doesn't work. And one of the things I talked about is that there are certain embryos that are never even going to keep growing. And we have no idea. There's no way we can know it. All the molecular biomolecules that we can look at are we need more time with them, to be able to tell it. And so we can't even use the spent media to determine if the embryo is going to keep growing or not at this point. At least at this point, we might be able to in the future. And so I would love a day where we can sit there and know, does this embryo even have a chance? Maybe AI will be able to look at and go, no, it's not going to do well. Put a second embryo with it or something like that. And that's where I would look forward to, because the thing is that, you and I know this, that when you put an embryo back and it fails, most of the time you do another transfer and it's going to work. Right. that everyone's hitting the panic button, and they should. I've been through it. It's scary as hell. But you and I know that most time people end up getting pregnant later, right? There's very few patients who you just never can get implantation. There's always a reason you find. But going through that process, that's a month of their life where they put through, right? And then to know in hindsight that maybe that embryo never would have worked, to make them go through that is horrible. And every time it's a notch that goes, it's not going to work. I'm never going to have a baby. And it doesn't even matter. I've had patients put embryos back that we knew weren't even good. And we said, listen, the chance are really low. It's a high mosaic, a not good grade. And then they would still be devastated. even though we talked about ahead of time, the chances are very low. And so I think that's going to be something I'm really excited about, is there's a day where we can tell if the embryo is good enough to go. We're not just basing off of scores, because that's something that, I mean, we know that scores really don't mean a ton. There is some benefit, but once you get genetics out of the way, I mean, really the difference from the best to the worst, meaning in a category, obviously not the worst, like they're falling apart, but the ones that we're transferring are not that big of a difference in game credit, but there are things that are there that we just don't know, that we can't see. And so that's what I'm looking forward to, because we can't fix everything, but the thing that would make me feel horrible is knowing that if there were embryos that were never going to work, why transfer them? I mean, if we know for sure, or at least transfer the ones before because it's just so devastating for people. So
right. I totally agree with that.
One person asked a question I saw here: is there ever a chance that stem cells can mutate and be bad? So in other words, could it cause harm in that situation? That's an interesting question. I never thought about that. So
yeah.
You want to tackle it, or you want me to answer that?
I mean, well, I'll give you my 2 cents. This won't be long. I mean, it depends kind of how the stem cells are being targeted, how they're being kind of introduced into the body. I mean, we know, like, for example, like some of the initial studies with genetic technology using CRISPR, they had off-target insertions. So said in another way, things went a little sideways. They went in places where we didn't want them to go. And so obviously this is a concern with stem cells. Now again, I'm not a basic scientist, and it's been a while since I've been in the lab. But I think with stem cells, the bigger thing is just not getting them to actually not getting them to start growing where you want them to grow.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, I normally, you're starting at 2 points: cells that are already differentiated, that you're putting in there, that already are going the path they're going, or they just don't take. Rarely is, for example, you're going to put the stem cells in that become a heart cells. That's not going to, that's not something that will really happen. We can't say it won't ever happen, but that really wouldn't be the situation, which I think is what they're asking. Couple questions come out. I think they're really important questions I wanted to just go over. I want to kind of nail them out real fast. One of them here from Monique is, what is the oldest age for mom that's comfortable doing? I think this is a very tough question, because we keep our age pretty wide open, and we do it on purpose because it's kind of a case-by-case scenario. You could be 45 and be dangerous for you to put an embryo back. You could be 55 and be perfectly fine. And I think there's just, you have to look at individually. You have to have people evaluate. So there is a point at certain ages, there's certain evaluations we make patients do that we don't do from 42 and younger. Sometimes we even have to have you get cleared by a doctor before going through. And then there's just other important things, like the other hard part that gets involved is kind of ethics, like at what point is it dangerous, not just for your health, but like at some point you have a baby. And for example, I think we can all agree, like if someone was 100, it'd be crazy to do. But where's that number change? And at some point, if we keep getting healthier, what if we start living longer to 200 years? Well, that's not crazy anymore. So that number is always changing, and it's kind of a case by case. But in general, most places, when you start getting like 60 is where people start feeling a little bit more uncomfortable. A lot of places even have as low as like 50 in their 50s. Some places we don't have that. But I mean, anything to add to that, Dr. Salem?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one of those things where that's why it's so important that there's just not some blanket rule. Like, it's really important to have a case by case basis, understanding what the risks are. I mean, let's be honest, like, the risk of some type of complication. Now, the complication to some people might feel like that wasn't a complication. That was totally fine by me to have a C-section. But the risk of a quote unquote medical complication beyond a certain age, it starts to approach 100%. I mean, so that is not a reason not to do it. It's just something to be aware of. Our job is to make you aware of, hey, this is what you're getting yourself into. from a medical standpoint. Now, the other part of that story is that I think as the risk starts to really increase, it's really important to have multiple experts weighing in on it. So a lot of times we have like, you know, a high risk OB doctor, or maybe you have a heart issue. Maybe you're only 43, but you have a significant heart issue. We have you go see a cardiologist, and your cardiologist is going to have to weigh in and say, hey, you know, I'm clearing, you know, so-and-so to go through with a pregnancy. So it's this kind of collaborative approach that we're all taking as professionals to keep you safe together. And I think the issue here is safety. You know, it's really all about safety.
It is. It's interesting though, because I think I brought this up before. You know, you hear this a lot. Someone says, well, if someone's 60 years old and they get pregnant, like, you know, are they going to be alive for their kids, you know, graduation? But what's weird about that, and I brought this up, is if the woman is 65, but the guy is 40, we all still kind of shun against that. But if the woman is 35 and the guy is 60, we don't even blink an eye. We don't even go, well, he may not be there for the graduation. So it's just kind of interesting in society how we have these slightly different views. And I think it's because mothers are more of, you know, we think of them as the nurturers, you know, in that situation. Before we get the very last one, or anything you want to go, question was, because I think this is important, because I mentioned this during the show, and I want people to understand this, and that it was, if you're not using insurance for IVF, could I still transfer 2 embryos? So unfortunately, no. And the reason why is, and again, this is not a personal choice by us, by the way. We have no desire to take away people's choice. Matter of fact, I would even say it pisses me off. What's happening is that places are kind of getting lazy now, and they're not sitting there and going, okay, well, as long as our patients aren't getting it, it's not an issue. What they're doing is now they're looking at data. They're looking at SART data. They're looking at the CDC data, and they go, wow, this place has a high twin rate. They're not even looking at it from the standpoint of just how many twins you're transferring. They're just looking at that twin rate. And so unfortunately, that's what we're being judged by. And so the only way we'll be able to do that in the future, and we're still trying to think of ways to do it that doesn't get, you know, in a way reported that way, is, you know, whether through research or other things like that. But unfortunately, at this time, you're going to see a lot of clinics going like this, because again, they will lose contracts. And especially if we do get, which again would be great, both presidential nominees are saying we're going to get free IVF, then it's even more insurance, and those insurance contracts are going to be more important. So it is definitely not something out of choice. It is stubbornly, we're upset about it, but it's something we have to do, or we won't be able to continue to be able to see insurance patients anymore. And so just so people know that, and I just wanted to at least bring that up to explain that. Do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I mean, I think the one big thing here as well is, like, there, you know, ASRM still has some guidelines around, you know, our, like, the governing body, let's call it, has some guidelines around being able to transfer 2 embryos in certain scenarios where it's still fair. So I think a lot of what we're talking about, remember, is PGT-tested embryos, you know, transferring them, certain age groups transferring them. You know, there are going to be some situations in which one can transfer, you know, more than 1 embryo. But again, you know, this is where it's really important. Talk with your doctor, talk with your clinic. I mean, I do think there are some clinics that are starting to have a blanket, like, absolutely nothing ever, you know, more than 1 embryo. But, you know, again, just talk with your individual team about that, because it is an important thing and it's evolving. I mean, I think part of what makes this feel like a jerky ride is that we're like, wait a second, but like 4 years ago, I could do a double embryo transfer. Like, what's changed since then? This, and Dr. Amos is really, you know, painting light on this. This is really an important topic in our field. So glad that it's been brought up. It's going to continue to come up, and we'll continue talking about it.
I think, like anything, the pendulum is going to swing a little bit. But I think one thing you made the point of, we are not a 1 embryo clinic like that. I mean, there are many times that there should be 2. But what it's saying is that if you're someone who's healthy, you have tested embryos, and you're just like, I want to put back 2, in that situation, we will not be able to do that. But what happens at our place is, we even made it very fair. It won't even be a decision by the doctor. It actually will go to a committee. The committee will look at it. They'll look at things like your history, whether, you know, you've had failed transfers in the past at other clinics or other medical problems, quality of embryos, and all those will go into the decision of if it's okay. So anyone can ask still to do it. It's just that it won't be a 1-person decision. It'll go to committee. But this is something that we're going to see more and more. We were one of the few clinics that's still allowed to, and in 2025, we're going to have to change it. Otherwise, like I said, we won't be able to keep up. But before we go, that one more question came up. This is only because I saw in the corner of my eye was a stem cell question asked, could the stem cell become a sperm? And the answer is no. The stem cell would not be able to all of a sudden become a sperm. That would not be possible. But before we head off, Dr. Salem, anything that you want to talk about with transfers or anything like that?
No, I think you owe me some McDonald's French fries, though.
I mean, I have once McDonald's French fries. I was literally today talking. I think all week I've been telling patients about the McDonald's French fries. I like them so much, and I got some pushback. People said they're not the best, and that they were saying that there are other fries better. Which I fired them on the spot, obviously, because I mean, how dare you say that about my McDonald's French fries? So. That is a joke, by the way. I did not fire them. So everyone, thanks so much for coming on. We got one person come on live today, lots of questions. But again, please feel free to come on. And if you're interested in those embryos, like I talked about, all the information will be provided to you. Reach out to our clinic, ask for the third-party coordinator, and then they'll get you with her. You don't even have to be a patient of ours. You can be someone who's just seen the show, and you can still get them as well. But like I said, just reach out. Thanks so much for your help. Ari, thank you so much for your help too. I know you're hidden there in the background, but thanks for your help with everything as well. You guys have a great night. Bye-bye.